So in our next section, we're going to talk a little bit about debriefing techniques. For those of you not steeped in SIM, this will be a little bit rapid and a lot of language. There are whole fellowships on this. But we wanted to get some of those words in there, some of those key terms. If you don't understand all of it or have questions, we'll talk about it, or certainly in the small groups, we can break some of this down some more as well.
Okay, so I'm just going to give you a very, very brief overview of debriefing. Okay, this is sort of the magic word with all of us simulation, non-simulation trained sim people kind of gloat over. So debriefing, what is it? It's sort of a principle that's predicated in adult learning, okay? And it's a little bit different from the regular lecture-based learning that we're all used to. It's very heavily steeped in principles of andragogy. Adults learn what they perceive as important to them, right? So if you want to know how to intubate somebody with a failing airway, you're going to find out ways to learn that. Really, the critical keystone adult learning theories, I'm not going to go into them, are Kolb's experiential learning and Mesereau's transformative learning. And basically, you have a learner who goes through a process where they get disoriented, they reflect on it, they go back, acquire some education on whatever they got disoriented about, will go back and reapply it in real time, and that's how adult learning occurs. So if you start to try to define what debriefing is, it's basically a conversation or a dialogue that happens between people, okay, usually faculty and a learner, but it can also happen between peers. You review either a real or a simulated event. You ask the participants to analyze their actions. You ask them to reflect on their thoughts, their psychomotor skills, and their emotional states. Very critical to some of the principles of debriefing is the idea of frames or mindsets of people. And the idea is really to sustain and improve performance in the long run. At the bottom, I've taken that from Jenny Rudolph's landmark paper about advocacy inquiry, and essentially that summarizes debriefing in a nutshell. Okay, so you are simulating, for instance, you observe a performance gap, you provide feedback about the performance gap, and you try to figure out why that happened in the first place. You investigate it, and then you try to help close that through, either giving pearls or some kind of focused didactic. There's different models of debriefing that you can use. There's plus delta, that is widely, utilized. By show of hands, how many of you guys actually use plus delta? Most of the time, yeah, okay. There's the gather, analyze, summarize. Anybody use that one? Okay, advocacy inquiry, yeah. And the pearls, the blended debrief, it's coming up more and more. Yeah, I like using that. And rapid cycle, anybody use that? Okay, yeah, all right. So I'll go over all of those. They have some common phases, okay? You have the setting the stage, which we kind of talked about a little bit, the pre-briefing, the fiction contract, and all that kind of stuff. Once you've done that in the beginning, then you start to, come back into your, debrief. So once you're there, the first thing I like to do is kind of get everybody's emotions out in the open. Sometimes, as you're sure everybody's experienced this, your learners get very angry, very emotional, very upset, and you really want to kind of leave that at the door. So the way you do it, you basically ask them to vent. Okay, so it's called different things. Sometimes it's called a reaction phase, other times it's called a diffusing or a venting phase. But it means the same thing. You ask them to share that touchy-feely thing that they don't like to talk about. You talk about emotions. The next phase is a description phase, usually basically a summary of what the case was about. And then an understanding of explorative phase where you kind of go deep dive into trying to understand what their frames are, where they're coming from, and why the actions that were observed actually occurred. And then you try to summarize with, your take-home points, which I think is really important. So a couple of things, we talk about setting the stage. What you really do want to do is create, and I think this is a little bit of regurg, but, make sure this is a psychologically safe space for your learners. Keep your learning objectives in mind. Sometimes it's important to, repeat those. Always be calm and collected. Remember, it's never about you personally. If there's somebody super mad at you, it's never about you. It's just completely something not related to you. So don't take it personally. Have genuine curiosity about your learners. All actions are well-intentioned. Nobody's getting out there to deliberately kill a patient, for instance. Remember to ask open-ended questions. Please don't use debriefing as a personal venting space. For instance, if you're really mad at a learner in the clinical workspace, don't make sure that doesn't transfer into your sim. Because I've seen that happen where, a faculty member, they just had an awful shift with a learner, but they're also debriefing the learner 2 weeks later, different case, but some of that transfers over. Please try not to do that. Don't try to assign blame or teach the learners a lesson, because that will never go down well. We are innately prone to doing this, right? Because we're all type A people. Please don't do that. Don't dive immediately into a debrief if you are upset, right? That's like my number one take of it. You might be superseding mad, like Mike pointed out, that they may have totally screwed something up to the point where you're like, okay, this is a colossal, F-bomb up. But don't dive into that debrief if you're mad. Just take a couple of minutes before going in. Don't use guess what I'm thinking type questions, which is basically, you try to give them a couple of chances to come up with what you're thinking in terms of a differential or something like that. And they'll just keep on going and never guess what you're thinking because they can't read minds. So really quickly, the plus delta approach, super simple to employ. You basically start this off with, what do you think went well, right? Sometimes you actually have a board. You can write plus on the one side, delta on the other. And you ask the learners, what went well? What could you have improved on? And how can we do this differently to make it better in the future? The pros and cons of this approach, it's really fast, it's very brief, it's very generic. It is really focused on observe actions, but also it elicits the learner's interpretation of what they did. It's very easy if you're short on time. The problem with it is it doesn't really go very much into depth most of the time. Okay, so you won't necessarily be able to get into the psychological reasons why somebody did what they did. The gather-analyze approach basically is similar, but in the gather phase, the team discussion, you recapitulate the SIM events to arrive at a shared mental model. In the analysis phase, the learner, sort of a learner-centered guided self-reflection and analysis of specific actions. You ask pointed questions to clarify the learner's thought processes, and then you summarize the salient take-home points. The pros of this approach, of course, is a group feedback technique, a critique. There is behavioral impact through self-reflection mostly. And it's less of a chance of the learner getting defensive, which is quite important, but it does take a little bit of time, so you should be prepared to spend some time. Advocacy inquiry, probably one of the best known approaches right now. Very, very psychologically heavy, okay, so human behavior based. The whole notion is all of us have pre-existing frames or lenses with which we view the world, right? And because of those frames, we are likely to act in certain clinical ways. And the idea is that you try to uncover those frames that lead to potentially mistakes and or suboptimal performance while you're simming. When a learner uncovers their frames, they can reflect on it. That will lead to change in behavior. The pros of this is it can be one-on-one. You can apply it in group as well. But there is a behavioral impact because people will really self-reflect on, oh my gosh, like I totally didn't learn this protocol correctly, or I was working off a complete misassumption. And then because you do it in a way where you're genuinely curious, there's less of a chance that your learner will get defensive. But to do it right, you should be prepared to spend time. Because if you do it in less time than allotted, or trying to hurry the process, you might actually do some damage. There's a script for this, which I like giving out, especially to my faculty who don't know anything about debriefing, which is basically you start with a statement such as, I observed blank, where blank is an action that you actually saw, okay? I would have done blank, which is something that you would have done differently based on your personal feeling, opinion, whatever. And this could be stemmed from, ASAP teaching guidelines, whatever. But you insert in there. And then you kind of open on this. What are your thoughts on this? Talk to me about it, right? And that's how you kind of go into getting them to talk about it. So rapid cycle deliberate practice. So I actually really like this approach, especially for medical students and junior learners and intern level learners. It is a newer strategy, but not really. It's been around. It's just kind of getting more momentum now. And the whole concept is that you really deliberately practice procedures and or sessions repetitively just to kind of get some kind of mastery over it. As opposed to end of simulation debriefing, you get a lot of in-simulation debriefing, which is a novel concept, and people kind of gasp, oh my God, how can you do it? Well, you can. And the whole idea behind it is that you start the sim, you pause, you give direct feedback about what they did. If they're doing something colossally wrong, you just say, hey, okay, this is what you're supposed to do according to PAL's guidelines, here are the guidelines, and let's start again. So until you get the mastery for it. It's basically been made popular by Betsy Hunt and PALs recently, but it's been, it's been present before. This slide kind of shows a general structure for it, where, for a simple structure, you start out with, maybe just like the back valve mask, then you add a little bit more, stop, recycle, add a little bit more, and so on and so forth. The pros and cons for novice learner, it's really good. Very good for algorithms and procedures, okay? But it's very directive. You're not really getting into the frames of the learner. And the whole concept is sometimes, especially if you're like a second, third, fourth year medical student, you may not have frames to begin with, right? Like we go about the lens that everybody has. But if you don't have any clinical experience, you may not have that. And so for those kind of learners, it might be really good, useful. Okay. In the last few, I would say about a year and a half or so, I've started using this approach that I really like. It's a blended approach, which says that no one of them, no single technique is ideal. You can actually use whatever is applicable to your learner at the moment. Okay, Epic and Cheng basically published this in 2015. The framework provides a combination of approaches that you can use that allows a lot of flexibility with respect to your debriefing style. If you have time constraints or you have very specific knowledge gaps, you can totally tailor this. So again, some of the stages are the same: setting the scene, exploring reactions, description of clarifying facts. But this is the analysis phase, is where you can actually really kind of apply a whole gamut of styles. And then, of course, you summarize. To kind of break it into it, so you can see the analysis phase. If there was a medication error, you can talk about that, like focused learned discussion. If there was something else, you can talk about that. Failed intubation, you can go back, make them repeat it until they really nail it, and so on and so forth. And, of course, you summarize it in the end. The pros and cons of it is it's super flexible. Sometimes there might be time constraints in terms of mastering it, because it's one of those things you have to kind of wrap your mind around. If you've been doing plus delta or you've been doing advocacy inquiry, it's kind of like, how do I just go from that to this? And the answer is that if you do it 3 or 4 times, you get pretty good at it. So that's sort of my 101 on debriefing. Hopefully it was useful.